Beneath the streets of Berlin lie vaults containing millions of meters of film footage, a visual record of history's darkest chapter, preserved by the very regime that perpetrated it. These are the forgotten images that the world must see to remember what must never happen again. The Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv, the German Federal Film Archive, holds within its climate-controlled chambers some of the most important documentary evidence of World War II and the Holocaust. These reels of film, shot by Nazi cameramen for propaganda purposes, have been transformed into tools of historical truth and education. This is the story of how these materials were preserved, what they reveal, and why they remain essential to our understanding of the past. In a nondescript government building in Berlin, thousands of rolls of film sat in climate-controlled vaults, preserved in near-perfect condition for more than 70 years. These were not Hollywood movies or propaganda films, though some were propaganda. They were fragments of history captured on celluloid, records of one of humanity's darkest periods preserved by the very regime that created that darkness. The archive contains millions of meters of film footage shot during the Nazi period, footage that documented everything from military parades to concentration camps, from the rise of Hitler to the rubble of Germany's defeat. When the Third Reich began in 1933, the Nazi regime understood the power of visual propaganda. Hitler had experienced World War I as a soldier, but he came to understand that the modern world would be shaped by images as much as by words. The Nazi regime hired documentary filmmakers to create newsreels and feature films that glorified the regime and portrayed the German people as a master race destined to conquer Europe. The most famous of these propagandists was Leni Riefenstahl, whose documentary of the 1936 Berlin Olympics became a masterpiece of filmmaking and a chilling example of how cinema could be perverted to serve authoritarian purposes. But beyond the famous propaganda films, thousands of cameramen throughout Germany and occupied Europe shot countless hours of footage documenting the regime's activities. The Nazi leadership recognized that these films had documentary value for posterity. They believed that the thousand-year Reich would endure forever, and they wanted future generations to have a comprehensive record of how they had built their empire. Therefore, they created a centralized film archive where copies of all significant footage shot in German territories was deposited. This archive was housed in a vast bunker system beneath Berlin, protected from bombing raids. The archive was maintained by archivists who were trained to preserve the films properly and to organize them in a systematic manner so that they could be accessed for research and propaganda purposes. Ironically, by creating this archive for their own purposes, the Nazis inadvertently created the most comprehensive visual documentation of their own regime that has ever existed. As the war progressed and Germany began to face defeat, the Nazi regime grew concerned about the safety of the archives. By 1944, it was clear that Berlin would eventually be captured by the Soviet Union. The Nazis began moving the most important films to safer locations, hiding them in caves and abandoned mines in southern Germany. They feared that the Soviets would either destroy the films or use them for their own purposes. Some materials were also sent to other Nazi-controlled territories, hoping they might survive the war in neutral or remote locations. The archivists who worked with the films were given orders to preserve them at all costs to ensure that the record of the Third Reich would survive into the post-war world. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied forces discovering the archives were shocked by the extent of the collection. American and Soviet forces found copies of films in different locations. The American military collected many of these materials and brought them back to the United States, where they were stored and eventually made available to researchers. Soviet forces also captured significant quantities of film materials, which they kept in the Soviet Union for decades. The original materials and many copies were lost or destroyed in the chaos of the final days of the war. Yet a substantial portion of the archive survived, scattered across Europe and America, but ultimately recoverable and restorable. In the post-war period, the division of Germany into West and East created complications for the archive. The Soviet zone held significant quantities of film materials that were kept secret for decades. The Western zones held other materials that were gradually organized and preserved. After the Cold War ended and Germany was reunified in 1990, efforts began to locate and consolidate the scattered materials. The Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv was reorganized and expanded. Film archivists from around the world began the painstaking work of cataloging, restoring, and preserving the vast collection of footage. Materials that had been damaged by time, Improper storage and the chaos of war had to be carefully restored to watchable condition. Dr. Heinrich Weber was a professional film archivist who had worked in the German film archive since the 1932. He had seen the Nazi regime come to power, had worked during the years of Nazi rule, and had witnessed the catastrophe of Germany's defeat. Unlike many who had served the Nazi regime and tried to hide their involvement after the war, Weber took a different path. He recognized that the films in the archive, created under Nazi auspices and for Nazi purposes, nevertheless contained historically valuable information. They documented not only Nazi propaganda and military activities, but also the everyday life of the German people, the development of German industry, and in some cases, inadvertently, evidence of the crimes the regime was committing. After the war ended, Weber was questioned by American intelligence officers about the archive. He cooperated fully, providing information about where materials had been hidden and how they had been preserved. He helped guide the Americans, and later the British, to the various locations where film materials had been stored. In many cases, the materials were in poor condition, having been stored in damp caves or damaged by shelling during the final months of the war. Nevertheless, thousands of meters of film were recovered. Weber then spent the next several decades working to restore these materials and to organize them in a way that made them accessible to researchers and historians. He did this work knowing that many would view his role with suspicion, believing that because he had worked for the Nazi regime, he was complicit in its crimes. The contents of the archive revealed the full scope of Nazi Germany's activities. There was propaganda footage showing Hitler addressing massive rallies, German soldiers on parade, factories producing weapons, and the construction of public buildings. But there was also other footage, filmed by cameramen who were documenting events for the regime without fully understanding what they were documenting. There were films of German soldiers massacring civilians in occupied territories. There were films of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that followed German armies into Eastern Europe, shooting thousands of Jews and Soviet civilians. There were films taken at concentration camps, some showing the arrival of prisoners, others showing work details and conditions inside the camps. Most shocking of all, there was even film footage taken inside some extermination camps, though the full horror of what was happening in those camps was not captured on film for the world to see until after the war, when Allied forces liberated the camps. The discovery of this footage presented historians with an unprecedented opportunity to document the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes with visual evidence. It also presented moral and ethical questions about how to use this material. Should the most graphic footage be shown publicly? Would showing such material help people understand the horror of the Holocaust? Or would it traumatize viewers? How should the footage be preserved? Should it be restored to pristine condition? Or should some signs of damage and age be retained as a reminder of how close these materials came to being lost forever? Different organizations and countries answered these questions differently. In the decades following the war, the materials in the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv were used for various purposes. Documentary filmmakers used footage to create films about World War II and the Holocaust. Historians used the materials for research and scholarship. The materials were used in trials of Nazi war criminals, providing visual evidence of crimes. Educational institutions used selected footage to teach students about the Nazi period. As video technology advanced and the internet emerged, the archive began digitizing its collection, making materials available to researchers around the world without requiring them to travel to Berlin. The archive also began making some materials available to the general public through educational websites and documentaries. However, the existence of vast quantities of Nazi propaganda material in the archive also raised concerns about misuse. Far-right extremists and Holocaust deniers have sometimes attempted to use archival materials to support their claims. Careful historical context is necessary when viewing any material from the archive to ensure that propaganda is not mistaken for factual documentation. The Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv has worked to provide this context, creating extensive metadata for each film that explains what was being filmed, who filmed it, when it was filmed, and what historical context was relevant. Researchers are encouraged to view all materials with a critical eye, understanding that much of what was filmed was created for propaganda purposes and should not be accepted at face value. One of the most significant discoveries in the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv has been footage that documented the Holocaust. For decades after the war, many people around the world did not have a comprehensive understanding of the full horror of what had occurred in the concentration and extermination camps. Survivors' testimonies were powerful, but many in the post-war world seemed reluctant to fully accept the magnitude of the crimes. Visual evidence from the Nazi archives helped change this. Footage showing the arrival of prisoners at camps, footage of the living conditions, footage of mass graves and crematoriums provided undeniable proof of what had happened. This footage has been used extensively in Holocaust education programs, helping new generations understand the reality of the genocide. Dr. Sarah Lieberman, a historian specializing in the Holocaust, spent years working with the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv to identify and catalog Holocaust-related materials. She was tasked with reviewing hundreds of hours of footage to determine which materials documented Holocaust activities and which did not. It was emotionally exhausting work. She watched footage of people being transported to their deaths, watched footage shot inside the camps, watched documentation of crimes on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Yet she knew the work was essential. By carefully cataloging and contextualizing this material, she was helping ensure that future generations would have access to historical documentation that could not be denied or disputed. She worked with her teams to create educational materials that presented the footage with appropriate historical context and warnings about disturbing content. The archive also contains substantial footage of the German military, including combat footage from multiple theaters of war. There was footage of tank operations, infantry combat, air force activities, and naval operations. This material has been invaluable for military historians seeking to understand German military tactics and operations. The footage shows the effectiveness of German military equipment and tactics, but it also shows the massive scale of German military operations. For researchers studying the war from a military history perspective, the archive provides a level of detail and visual documentation that would be impossible to obtain from written records alone. Documentary filmmakers have used this material extensively in creating programs about World War II military campaigns. Another important category of materials in the archive documents German industry and technology during the Nazi period. There is footage of German factories producing weapons, aircraft, and other military equipment. There is footage of German scientists and engineers working on various projects. Some of this footage provides insights into German technological development during the war period. It documents the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, German aircraft development, German tank production, and other aspects of German military industrial capacity. For historians of technology and military science, these materials provide valuable documentation of German technological capabilities and limitations. The preservation of the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv has also raised interesting questions about historical responsibility and collective memory. The archive exists in Germany, a nation that has worked very deliberately to confront its Nazi past and to ensure that the horrors of that period are never forgotten or repeated. The archive is maintained by German government institutions and is used extensively in German schools to educate students about the dangers of totalitarianism and the consequences of Nazi ideology. For Germans born after the war, the archive provides visual documentation of a period that most would prefer to forget, but which they have acknowledged must be remembered and studied so that such horrors are never repeated. In the 21st century, the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv has embraced digital technology to preserve and share its materials. The archive has digitized vast quantities of its collection, creating high-resolution digital copies of the original film materials. These digital copies are being preserved according to modern archival standards, with multiple backup copies stored in secure locations. The archive has also created an online database that allows researchers and students to search for materials and view selected footage. Some materials are restricted and available only to qualified researchers, while other materials are freely available to the general public. This approach balances the need for historical preservation and public access with concerns about the potential misuse of sensitive materials. The role of the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv in Holocaust remembrance and documentation cannot be overstated. The archive holds footage that provides some of the only visual evidence of what occurred in the concentration camps. While the most graphic footage, such as film, shot in the extermination camps themselves is limited, what does exist provides undeniable proof of the existence and operation of these facilities. This has been crucial in countering Holocaust denial, which has unfortunately persisted into the 21st century. When Holocaust deniers claim that the camps never existed or that the scale of killings has been exaggerated, the visual evidence from the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv provides documentary proof that their claims are false. Dr. Weber, who had dedicated his post-war career to preserving and organizing the archive, died in 1982. He had lived long enough to see the archive become recognized as one of the most important historical resources in the world. He had lived long enough to see his own reputation rehabilitated, as historians came to understand that his work preserving the materials was motivated by a commitment to historical truth rather than any sympathy with Nazi ideology. His legacy lives on in the careful work of the archivists who continue to maintain and expand the collection. The archive today is a monument to historical documentation and a resource for ensuring that future generations will have access to visual evidence of this critical period in human history. The materials in the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv have been used in countless documentaries, educational programs, and historical presentations. When Steven Spielberg created Schindler's List, one of the most acclaimed films about the Holocaust, he supplemented dramatic scenes with actual documentary footage from the era, including materials from the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv. When the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum created its permanent exhibition in Washington, D.C., it incorporated footage from the archive to help visitors understand the reality of the Holocaust. Schools around the world use materials from the archive to educate students about World War II and the dangers of totalitarianism. In this way, the footage shot by Nazi cameramen for propaganda purposes has been repurposed to serve the cause of historical truth and education. The preservation of the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv also raises broader questions about how societies preserve and remember difficult chapters in their histories. The archive does not hide or downplay the crimes documented in its materials. Instead, it makes the materials available for researchers and educators to use in understanding what happened. Germany, as a nation, has chosen to confront its Nazi past head-on, rather than attempting to forget it or deny it. This approach stands in contrast to some other nations that have attempted to suppress or minimize historical records of atrocities. The Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv represents Germany's commitment to ensuring that the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes are remembered and studied, and that future generations will understand the consequences of totalitarianism and hatred. Today, the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv contains over 4 million meters of film footage, covering not only the Nazi period, but also other periods of German history. The collection has been expanded to include materials related to the occupation of Germany after the war, the division of Germany during the Cold War, and the reunification of Germany in 1990. The archive has also acquired materials from other sources, including captured German materials held by other nations. The archive continues to grow and evolve as new materials are discovered and donated. Advanced preservation techniques are continuously being applied to protect the materials from degradation. Digital technology allows materials to be accessed by researchers around the world without requiring them to handle original film materials, which could cause damage. The story of the Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv is in many ways a story of redemption and truth. Materials created by a regime dedicated to propaganda and genocide have been transformed into tools for education and historical understanding. Cameramen who filmed for the Nazi regime inadvertently created documentation that has been used to prove the regime's crimes. Archivists and historians who have worked with these materials have dedicated themselves to ensuring that the truth is preserved and shared. The archive stands as a testament to the power of documentation, the importance of preservation, and the necessity of confronting difficult historical truths. The footage that remains from this dark period of history serves as a warning to future generations, a reminder of what can happen when hatred and totalitarianism are allowed to flourish unchecked. The Bundesarchiv Filmarchiv ensures that this warning will not be forgotten, that these images will endure, and that the lessons of World War II and the Holocaust will remain accessible to all who seek to understand them. In vaults beneath Berlin, history is preserved not to glorify the past, but to ensure that humanity never repeats it.